Hey guys, Brian Dean here, and in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to execute one of my favorite content frameworks, the Trusty Infographic. In fact, infographics in general are one of my all-time favorite strategies for generating backlinks and targeted traffic. That said, this isn't 2015 anymore, which means you can't just create a random infographic and expect people to share it. Instead, to get results today, you need to leverage the Trusty Infographic content framework. As you'll see in a minute, my approach is very different than how most other people approach infographic marketing. In fact, these differences are exactly why this content framework works so well. Now, before I get into these differences, let me quickly show you an example of the Trusty Infographic content framework in action, the shrinking dollar infographic. This is an infographic that I made for a client in the investing niche, and it did great. This infographic generated dozens of links from authority investment sites like zerohedge.com. And if you search for shrinking dollar plus infographic in Google, you'll notice that there are over 1,500 results. So why did this infographic do so well? Well, it's because the infographic leveraged one of the most powerful share triggers on the planet, social currency. Now, we already talked about the power of social currency in the first lesson from this module. But as a quick recap, social currency basically says if sharing something makes you look good, you're more likely to share it. And that's where infographics come into play. Because infographics contain hard data, they give you a unique opportunity to prove people right. But not just anyone, you have the opportunity to prove your link creators right. Your infographic gives link creators something tangible that they can point to and say, see, I told you that low-fat diets aren't healthy, here's proof. Now, that said, your infographic doesn't necessarily have to take a stand on a controversial issue. Pure practical value works well too. For example, take a look at my on-page SEO infographic. It's not controversial, and it doesn't take a stand, but it still did great. In fact, the page that I published my infographic on now has links from over 1,000 different sites. So even though my infographic was highly practical, it was something that my link creators could reference whenever they talked about optimizing content. In fact, that's the secret behind why my on-page SEO infographic did so well. It gives SEO bloggers something they can reference to show that on-page SEO is more than just fiddling around with title tags. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point, you're probably wondering, Brian, this sounds great, but how do I get started? Well, I'm glad you asked because now it's time to break down the entire process step by step. Your first step is to choose a topic for your infographic. And like any Power Page, you want your infographics topic to be something that your link creators already talk about and share. So as you review the list of potential topics that you found in Module 1, keep an eye out for topics that your link creators are especially passionate about. Specifically, look for topics that they take a strong stand on, or take note of any issues that your link creators argue for or against. For example, let's look again at the shrinking dollar infographic. In this case, my client was a precious metal dealer that sold gold coins, silver bars, etc. And I noticed that his link creators, which were investment and personal finance blogs, talked a lot about the topic of inflation. But they didn't just talk about it, they were mad that inflation was decreasing the dollar's value. And because my client's link creators had such a strong emotional connection to inflation, I went with that topic. So now it's time to find an angle within your topic. This angle is what makes your infographic stand out and generate shares and backlinks from link creators. As I mentioned earlier, pure informational infographics can work, but even they need an angle to be effective. So what do I mean by an angle exactly? An angle is simply a subtopic of the topic that you just came up with in step number 1. Specifically, a subtopic that tells a story. Remember, like I mentioned in lesson 1 from this module, storytelling is an underutilized and extremely powerful share trigger. And that's because stories cut through the noise and embed themselves into people's memories. Back in the day, a generic infographic that had fancy charts and graphs was enough to get attention, but today it's different. Thousands of infographics come out every single month, and for your infographic to grab attention and get shared, it needs to tell a story. Joe Cardillo, who has been part of literally hundreds of infographic campaigns during his time at Visually, says that, quote, every single thing we've created that's gone viral had a narrative. For example, look at the shrinking dollar infographic. Now, the link creators in the investing niche talked a lot about inflation. That was the topic, but I still needed an angle that told a story. And I couldn't help but notice that at the time, my link creators wrote a lot about how inflation is a huge problem for the average consumer because it makes their money less valuable. So I made my angle, inflation is hurting the purchasing power of the average American. Let's look at another example. This table tennis infographic is a Trusty infographic that an SEO That Works graduate recently published. Now, on the surface, this might look like a 100% informational infographic, but it has an angle. The angle is that table tennis isn't just a game to kill some time. It's a legitimate sport that's comparable to other forms of exercise like yoga and walking. And this infographic performed really well. Even though this SEO That Works graduate is in a super obscure niche, ping pong tables, his infographic generated a handful of quality backlinks from authority sites in the home leisure niche. And that's because these link creators love to share anything that legitimizes table tennis, which is exactly what this infographic did. The bottom line, the work you did in Module 1 will pay dividends now. You can use your intimate knowledge of your link creators to understand topics they're interested in and the angles that they're super passionate about. Step number 3 is to gather your info. So at this point, you have a topic and an angle. Now it's just a matter of collecting the data that you'll use to support your angle and ultimately tell your story. And this flies in the face of how most people create infographics. Most people think that the point of your data is to create cool looking charts and graphs. And that's exactly why most infographics fall flat. So if you want a consistent system that generates successful infographics again and again, you need to forget the fancy charts. Instead, the data in your infographic needs to first and foremost tell a story. Specifically, you want to tell your story with 6 to 10 data points. Why 6 to 10? Fewer than 6 and you just don't have enough evidence to prove that your angle is true. And any more than 10 and your story gets lost in the numbers. For example, let's take a look at the shrinking dollar infographic we've talked about a few times already. This infographic only has 7 main data points. Now, based on my research, I could have included 20 or more stats, but I focused on presenting the handful of statistics that told the best story. And I outlined 3 simple strategies that you can use to find your data in the worksheet. But for now, let's move on to step number 4, which is to create your infographics wireframe. So you've collected some data and whittled them down to the 6 to 10 stats that support your angle and tell your story. Nice work. Now it's time to structure the infographic itself. Like we do with every content framework, let's start at the top and work our way down. First up, we have the title. So the title of your infographic is different than a title for a blog post for 2 main reasons. First, you just don't have a lot of room on the infographic for a really long title. You have about 10 words to work with at most. And that means that your title has to be short, sweet, and to the point. Second, the purpose of your infographic title is to introduce the story. For example, the title of the shrinking dollar infographic was obviously The Shrinking Dollar. That 3-word title summed up what investing and personal finance link creators cared about, that inflation is decreasing the purchasing power of the dollar. Let's look at another example of a great infographic title. This is your brain on visualization. Neil from QuickSpout realized that his link creators, marketing and SEO blogs, were super interested in visual content like videos and infographics. So he created an infographic that supported an angle that his link creators cared about. Visual content resonates better than text. And his title, This is Your Brain on Visualization, introduces that angle beautifully. Next, you need a little bit of intro copy to go below your infographics title. That way, people will know right away what angle you're covering before they see the first piece of data. To give you an example, the shrinking dollar infographic intro is only 24 words. But in those 24 words, it makes the case that inflation is eroding the purchasing power of the dollar. So within seconds, you know exactly what my angle and story is. Next, it's time to organize the 6 to 10 data points you found in step 3. Here's how. First, put the most eye-catching information at the very top. This grabs people's attention and it also helps set up the rest of the story. For example, I put the fact that purchasing power has decreased by 94% at the very top of the shrinking dollar infographic. This was an eye-catching stat that put the rest of the infographics data into context. Next, the rest of your data should be specific stats that tell the details of your story. So, in the case of the shrinking dollar infographic, the first statistic, purchasing power has decreased by 94%, gave people the big idea concept that inflation is a real problem. And the rest of the stats in the infographic dig into the details of why and what this means in practical terms. For example, I showed how inflation influences the price of gasoline and bread. These stats support and expand on the purchasing power has decreased by 94% statistic that I led off with. Next up, it's time to design your infographic. So here's the deal with infographic design. With the work you've done so far, you're already ahead of 99% of everyone else creating generic infographics. In my experience, most people rush through steps 1 to 4 of this process if they even do them at all. Instead, they spend all of their time and energy on the design, and it's a huge mistake. Sure, of course, design is important, but in my experience, design only makes up about 10% of an infographic success. The other 90% is the work you just did in steps 1 through 4. Obviously, unless you're an amazing graphic designer, you'll want to hire a pro to design your infographic. But even then, you don't want to leave the design 100% up to the graphic designer. After studying infographics that perform well and those that don't, I've found that successful infographics tend to follow the same 3 design principles. So let's briefly cover these 3 principles right now. Our first principle is lots of space. Remember, the point of your infographic is to tell a story and to support an angle that your link creators believe in. So there's no need to clutter your infographic with lots of text, charts, or data. In fact, I see a lot of infographics like this that try to cram as much information as possible into a tight space. And all that does is overwhelm people and hide the story you're trying to tell. Instead, stick to the 6 to 10 point data limit, which leaves your information plenty of room to breathe. For example, look at the on-page SEO infographic I mentioned earlier. Notice how there's a lot of room between all the data points, the text, and the visuals. This makes the information much easier to read and understand. Our second design principle is to use 2 to 3 main colors. And the fact is, lots of people make the infographic look like a big bag of Skittles. I mean, just look at this infographic. There must be 12 colors in there. Instead, I recommend limiting your infographic to no more than 3 primary colors. This is another infographic that I made for one of my SEO clients. Notice how the infographic only has 3 main colors: silver, black, and gold. This limited color scheme gives the infographic a unique identity, and it also makes the visuals clear and easy to read. Our last principle is to use creative visuals. One of the cool things about infographics is that you're not limited to boring pie charts or bar charts. So don't be afraid to be creative with how you present your data. This helps your infographic stand out and makes it more memorable to your link creators. For example, I could have used a normal bar chart to represent the value of $1 now versus 1980 here. But I knew the images of coins, bread, and gas cans would stand out. Again, the design here doesn't pop, it's not fancy, but it works. Our last step, step number 6, is to promote your infographic. In Module 3, you'll learn about the battle-tested content promotion and link building strategies that I've developed over the last 6 years. And while these strategies work for any power page, infographics have their own set of unique link building opportunities. And I'll cover these in a special infographic-focused lesson in Module 3. In the meantime, it's time to get cracking on your Trusty infographic content framework. So download the worksheet below this video to get started, and I'll see you in the next lesson.